As we talked about in class yesterday, World War I was a war that the United States at first did not want to get involved in. So what this lecture is going to cover is what were the steps that happened that took us from looking at World War I as an imperialist struggle between Germany and Great Britain to sending over thousands of troops to serve. So the topic of today's lecture is The War Hits Home. As you know from your note outline, this is coming from pages 583 to 589 in your textbooks. So as the war started, even before America was involved, there were many divided loyalties at home for a number of reasons. In 1914, most Americans were supportive of neutrality. They did not want the country to get involved for a variety of reasons. First, at the beginning of the war, American lives and American property weren't directly threatened. This was a war that was occurring across the Atlantic Ocean. Like I said, many believed it was just an imperialist struggle between Germany and England, which means we didn't have a dog in this fight. It was between these two countries who had to, get over their egos of wanting to gain more land for themselves. So it wasn't a fight that involved us. And then at probably the most basic and human level, Americans didn't want to send their children, their sons, their grandsons, their nephews. They didn't want to send them over to fight. War is not a pretty thing, and they didn't want to get involved because we didn't want to experience the injury and loss of life that always comes with war. An interesting factor, though, is that many Americans at this time are still immigrants, are first generation, or had been born in these countries that were fighting this war. So they still had ties to these home countries. It was hard for them to look at this struggle and to not want to cheer for their home country where they had come from. Many German Americans and Irish Americans, for example, tended to support the Central Powers. So where you would naturally think that we would maybe be fighting on the side of the Allies, many of these immigrants were still connected to the people that were fighting, and they were supportive of them. We also have a lot of support for the Allies in the country at this time. We have a common ancestry and language with them. Many Americans came from Great Britain. We speak the same language as them. That just tends to lead us to be more supportive of this side in the war. We have similar democratic and legal systems. The Central Powers at this time, many of them had monarchies still or dictatorships, whereas in Great Britain, you have parliament, you have a similar legal system. Much of our American Bill of Rights is based on the English Bill of Rights. So there was just a lot of similarities between our country and the Allied countries, so we tended to favor and support those sides. And then finally, we have stronger economic ties with the Allies than we do with the Central Powers. A lot of our economy is based upon trade with these countries, so obviously we want them to be successful in their war efforts. So the first direct effect that we really feel from the war is the British blockade. So Great Britain puts a blockade of the North Sea. So this is the North Sea right over here. They blockade this area so that no goods can get into German markets. At first, this angers Americans because we're trying to get goods over to Germany and we can't get through it. So at first, we're upset by this. But then Germany's response goes way over the top and takes all of the American anger off of Great Britain and places it on Germany. They respond with a counter blockade using U-boats. U-boat stands for Unterseeboot, which is the German word for submarine. Germany launches what's known as unrestricted submarine warfare and is threatening to sink any ships that come into this area to try to save itself from this blockade. What really starts to push many Americans for favor of war was when Germany sank the Lusitania. This was a passenger ship. It was not a warship. It was sunk by a German U-boat, and 128 American lives were lost in the sinking of the Lusitania. The German U-boats continue to sink passenger ships, and the U.S. threatens to cut diplomatic ties with Germany, saying that it's fine if you want to use your submarines as a war tool, but you're involving these passenger ships that are not being used for war, so you're crossing a line, and they're really frustrated with this, but still not ready to fight, or you're still trying to use diplomacy to avoid getting involved in war. Germany responds by saying they need Britain to lift the blockade. Germans were starving. Food couldn't get into Germany. Fertilizer couldn't get into Germany. There were hundreds of thousands of Germans who then starved to death because of the British blockade. So Germany wants some things in response. The United States is trying to be diplomatic and to navigate its way through this, but it ends up not being very successful. So this gets us to 1916. The war's been going on for a couple of years, and Woodrow Wilson is running for re-election. His slogan is, "He kept us out of war." Because still, even though all these things are happening over in Europe, many Americans still haven't gotten to the point where they're ready to actually commit to fighting a war. And so because Wilson uses this slogan, he is able to win re-election in 1916. His goal is to bring a peace without victory. He doesn't want one side to finally demolish the other and force peace. He just wants both sides to agree to put down their weapons, to sign a treaty so that the world can move forward in peace. Germany's not about this plan. They ignore Wilson's request for peace, and they resume unrestricted submarine warfare. The U.S. knows that they have to respond, that we can't continue to run the risk of letting our ships go across the Atlantic and potentially being sunk and having American lives potentially being lost because of this U-boat warfare. A couple other things then happen that are finally the straw that break the camel's back in getting the United States involved in World War I. First is the Zimmermann Note. The Zimmermann Note was a telegram that was sent from the German foreign minister to Mexico, whose last name is Zimmermann. He sends a telegram in which he proposes an alliance. In his alliance, he says, if war with the United States breaks out, so if the U.S. gets involved in World War I, Germany would form an alliance with Mexico, and they would help recover land that Mexico had lost to the United States in the area of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So Germany wants Mexico to get involved in World War I. This freaks a lot of Americans out because all of a sudden, this war that's across the Atlantic Ocean has the potential to be very, very close to home, with Mexico getting involved in a land invasion of the Southwest United States. And then the final thing that happens that convinces the United States to join the war was the Russian Revolution. In March of 1917, the revolution overthrows the oppressive monarchy in Russia. So now you can truly say that the war features the Allies, which are democratic countries, fighting against brutal monarchies of the Central Powers. So this ideology factor now allows the Americans to feel confident joining the side of the Allies. Whereas before, when you have the czars ruling Russia, it's hard to support that kind of a regime when you're a country that's founded on democracy and freedom. Well, now the Russian Revolution has happened, the czar has been deposed from power, and now we can say that we are supporting democracy seeking to rule in Europe. In 1917, in April, so not even quite a year after his re-election, Congress passes Woodrow Wilson's war resolution. He gets to the point where he says, we can't ignore it anymore. We have to get involved. Germany, the Central Powers have pushed us too far. We need to fight. So April 1917, 3 years after the war begins, Congress agrees to declare war and enter World War I. At that time, we only had 200,000 men that were serving in our armed forces. And so this is where Congress passes the Selective Service Act. 24 million men registered under the Selective Service Act. 3 million were called up and 2 million actually reached Europe. So this is where we see this requiring men to register with the government in order to be randomly selected, otherwise known as the draft, because we didn't have enough people to adequately serve. 400,000 African Americans serve at this time. Many of them served in non-combat duties, but this is going to be a major factor in the civil rights movement, saying that we have African Americans who are serving for this country abroad. They need to be treated better at home. At the time of World War I, women are not allowed to enlist in the armed services, but they can serve in roles like nurses, as war secretaries. They can work as phone operators. So many women were involved in the war effort, just not in combat roles. So we're now involved in this war that's an ocean away, which means we need to expand our fleet of ships. We have to get all these people, supplies, food, weapons, everything across the Atlantic. And so the government enlists 4 steps to get this to happen. First of all, shipyard workers were exempted from the draft. So if you were a man who worked in a shipyard and your number was called up, you were exempt. You could defer your draft because you were deemed as an essential worker for the war effort. So they wanted to keep those that knew what they were doing in the shipyards at home so they could quickly and efficiently build ships for our fleet. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce joins in public relations campaign. They really want to emphasize the importance of shipyards. They were passing out flags for people that worked in shipyards. It's almost like, when you see the crosses on the doors of people who have veterans who are serving, that similar campaign was done for those who were still at home but were working in shipyards to just really promote the importance of these people and what they were doing for the war effort. Shipyards start using prefabrication techniques. So if something is prefab, what it means is it's the parts are made elsewhere in different factories, and then they're all brought to the shipyard where they are then assembled. This has a huge impact on the construction time. Ships are being able to be made a lot more quickly at this point, so we're able to get more ships done in less amount of time because of the use of prefab techniques. Finally, the fourth thing that was done was that the government took over ships that were already in existence. Ships that were being used for commercial use, that were owned by private citizens. The government took these over, deeming necessity in time of war, and they converted them into military ships. So while they were taking different steps to build more ships, they also were taking advantage of the ships that were already in existence. So with these different steps, America is now ready to send soldiers, supplies, weapons over to get involved in World War I to join the Allies and to take on the Central Powers.